Hello, welcome to episode 159 of the Book Binge for a very unusual type of video. Right about a month ago, I believe, maybe even a little bit less than a month ago, I covered my top 5 manga that I wanted to read. So a few manga that, as somebody who hasn't read very much of it and doesn't plan to read a whole lot of it, to be fair, what ones I'm more immediately interested in trying based off of recommendations from friends who understand my tastes in books, generally speaking, and also kind of understand a little bit more of a balance of what may or may not work for me. This week, we are reviewing the first one of those that I tried and the one that was top priority according to that list, Goodbye Eri by Tatsuki Fujimoto. So, it's my first manga review. This is probably going to be a shorter review as such, especially since it's just a one volume, one-off piece of work. We'll just see how this goes. I'm not sure if my normal review format will work for this, but we might as well give this a shot. I'm going to start off just like I do with all my normal book reviews, if you haven't tuned into any of those before, with the good of Goodbye Eri. And there's just going to be a few points that I'm going to bring up here. One of them that I think is the strongest. The strongest thing about Goodbye Eri to me is digging into deeply embedded existential fears. One of the primary things that made me interested in Goodbye Eri was watching a video that dealt with existential dread, essentially. And Goodbye Eri was one of the topics that that video covered. That's why I became interested in it. And I gotta say, the way that Fujimoto really dug into those aspects actually worked a lot better than I even already had believed that they were going to. There's not fears, and I should clarify, these isn't existential fear necessarily in the sense of like, horror. This isn't a horror story. It is very existential. That is why I use that term in that statement, because fears can encompass a lot of different things. And when it comes to a fear of existence, or not necessarily a fear of existence, but more like the fear of missing out on that kind of an experience, this manga, this volume, I don't really know what to refer to these. Like, I'm not inclined to refer to this as like a book, because it's not my traditional concept of what a book is. But either way, what this book is able to handle in that regard is quite good. Also, the way that it is able to circle back around on itself is very effective. There's maybe a few choices in it that I think are a little bit strange, or maybe wouldn't have made myself, but even those choices that I find a little bit strange do wrap around and become important later. Maybe not necessarily become important, but are reflected upon later, or are brought back in a way that makes it a little bit more poignant and emotional. And that is one of the things that I love about Goodbye Eri. Emotionally poignant moments to reflect everything about it and to really make you think. It's one that the more you think about it, the more questions you have regarding like plot and like what is and isn't like true. Like, true's not necessarily the right word. Like, what is and isn't real in this manga is something that you will question the more you think about it. And I think for good reason. And I think part of that is also the point, is to make you reflect not just on the lives of the relatively limited characters within this volume, but also within your own life. The very depiction of real people is also something that is really great, albeit with a pinch of fantasy, as the volume says at a few different points. It does have a couple other decisions that are a little bit less real, but those are for you to consider on, and maybe they are real, maybe they are for the sake of the plot, and if you've read it, you probably know what I mean, and I'm not going to say more because that would spoil it, even though we'll talk about spoiling things a little bit later. The bad of Goodbye Eri, I do think there are a couple things that I want to point out. There's nothing like super specific, I don't think. It's mostly that a couple decisions, as I briefly hinted at, when it comes to the pinch of fantasy, come off as a little bit odd or strange to me. And like, maybe they do for you as a reader, I don't know. But for me, there were a couple moments where, I'm like ever so slightly taken out of the story for a brief moment because of a couple weird things. There's certain specific moments like this that I just generally have minor gripes with, nothing that I would actively complain and say this makes it not worth reading or this makes it bad. It's just, maybe some of those things will actually seem really bad to some of you. I don't know. I'm not a manga reader. I don't know what of these things maybe are more common in media similar to it. But I think the main thing, aside from just very minor gripes that might turn certain people off to the story as a whole, is that the ending is very much different than what you might expect it to be. It has a very cathartic and painful ending that isn't the actual ending. It has an extra like 20 pages onto the end of that, and those 20 pages really change the way that you think about the story. They change the the entire concept of the story in their own way, and they are a little bit strange. I don't think that I dislike this. I think it's something that I should think a little bit more about. Although I do think maybe the last few pages, for example, I have a little bit of a harder time accepting, you could say. And most of that is forgiven because it does reflect on certain other points brought out in the story that, make it emotionally poignant, that make it seem more powerful. It's not just like super random the way these last few pages end. It's just not the way that I would have done it personally, but also because some of the decisions related to those last few pages I also would have done a little bit differently if it were me. But of course, this wasn't my story, so I'm just kind of speculating at this point. It is effective of an ending. It's just a little bit different. There are also aspects of the story that are inherently meta, very meta in fact, and purposely so. It does feel weird at times though. Like you can tell it's like part of the reason the story is what it is and part of the reason it is as powerful as it is, especially. But those meta aspects could, turn certain other people off if you're very opposed to that kind of thing. Moving into the ugly, this is where I'll talk a tiny bit about spoiling it. I'm not going to spoil the actual story, don't worry, this isn't about you, this is about my experience with Goodbye Area. I mentioned that I watched a video that discussed this story, and that was a video titled Horror Games About Waking Up from the YouTube channel Daryl Talks Games, one of my favorite channels, one of my favorite video essayists. Absolutely phenomenal channel. This video in particular really, really worked for me, and it covered the story because I, especially at the time, was not somebody who was super inclined to read manga or watch anime. I don't really have issue whenever Daryl brings up anime or manga stuff, just going through those portions of the video without regard for spoilers, because I never really have the intention to actively read any of those things anyway or watch any of those things. So like if it's to help make his point in the video, I'll let him make it, and that's that, right? This video, Horror Games About Waking Up, is about existential dread, and Goodbye Area is a pretty big part of that video. In fact, most of the latter third of it is about this story specifically, and I found it to be very powerful. When I watched that video, it's the reason that I was interested in reading the manga, despite knowing basically everything about it at that point. I knew most of the broad strokes and also plenty of the specifics. So what I did was I did decide to acquire the book. I believe somebody gifted it to me for my birthday last year. I forget off the top of my head. If that was you, I apologize for forgetting. But in acquiring the volume, I gave it several more months to, kind of think about and ponder about, and to purposely try to forget or allow myself to forget at least some of the details about the story so that maybe it would work for me a little bit better. Usually when I know what's going to happen in a story, emotional moments don't hit me as hard, and since the emotional aspect of Goodbye Area is what I was most interested in finding out about, I was worried about that. I was worried that I wouldn't like this as much as I wanted to based off of Daryl Talks Games video. But it turns out that this somehow still smacked me upside the head emotionally at a couple of different points. It was still very effective, and I did remember enough of the actual details, even though I still remembered the broad strokes, that it was able to actually get a tear from me at 2 different points specifically. Well, one time it almost did, one time it actually did. So despite only being 200 pages in one volume, it still hit me emotionally, and I'm actually very glad for that. As for the recommendation, Goodbye Area is a story about life, memory, love, and taking heed of the moment. And it's also about creativity. There's going to be something that I think most people will relate to from Goodbye Area in one aspect or another, whether that be the relationship aspect, whether that be the loss aspect, whether that be the creativity aspect. Any of those points are going to be something that a lot of people relate to, and I relate to one of them, particularly the creative side, very, very strongly. And so some of those things hit me a little bit harder than I was even anticipating for them to do. If you're anything like me as well, the moral surrounding the creativity through line of the story, the thing that blankets the rest of the story, the thing that blankets the life and the memory and the love and the other things that the story covers, it will ultimately just be an emotional journey for you, I think. And whether you're a manga reader or not, I certainly like this one, and because it's one volume and only took a couple hours even for me, who's very slow and had a lot of distractions that caused me to have to put it down temporarily multiple times throughout, I do think it's worth a shot. I'm by no means a manga reviewer or manga reader, so like I can't really compare this to anything. I can't really say how it fits in the broader medium because, like I said, I've experienced next to nothing. But for me, as the type of reader that I am, Goodbye Eri was one worth checking out. And even though I was spoiled for most of everything in it, it still managed to hit me. So if you happen to not know what this manga is about, if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it, and I recommend going in blind to see what hits you personally. So, how did my first manga review go? Based on my video notes and based on the way that I've been talking through this video, I think it was actually pretty good and that my general review format actually worked for this as well. It turns out I might do a couple more manga over the future, not anytime necessarily soon, but whenever I do, I guess I'm just going to follow the same format, so that works. Otherwise, I just want to give a shout out to Daryl Talks Games as well. I'm going to link that video and his channel in the description of this one below, specifically so that you can go check it out if you have read Goodbye Eri. There's a few other stories like movies and another manga and whatnot that he does cover in that video, and a couple games. Obviously, he's primarily a video game channel. That if you haven't experienced those, there will be spoilers for all those things, so like obviously go in with those warnings. He gives ample warning for those aspects, but if you have experienced any or all of those, yeah, that video is very, very good and I highly recommend it. But with that being said, I'm going to get out of your face now. Thank you for watching. I'll be back in the next video.